Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Gershuti, and I'm the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment Program. Thanks for tuning in to our Innovators, a Virtual Exchange of Ideas series today. We're featuring an innovator in carbon dioxide removal. We'll start with a short conversation between the two of us, followed by some Q&A for those who tuned in. So please submit your questions now via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We're excited to welcome today's guest, David Elenowitz, president and founder of Zero Carbon Partners, an investment and strategic operating firm focused on emerging companies in the low carbon space. David's also a senior advisor of Global Thermostat, a leading company engaged in carbon removal from both the atmosphere and industrial flue gas emissions. He's also a member of the advisory board of Solidia Technologies and X Prize for carbon dioxide removal. Welcome, David.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me.
How are you doing?
Doing great. Great to be here, Greg. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, so I wanted to start off by talking about how you made, a transition to this area. You have a background of working in private equity, and now you're a climate advocate and climate investor. What drove you in this direction, and why did you decide to focus on carbon removal?
Okay. Well, I spent about 25 years in private equity, during the course of which I invested in and ran a number of companies, typically growing them for the tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars, and sold my last company called Empire Today, a flooring business, which I grew from 40 million to 700 million in revenues and exited about 3 years ago. I'd thought about climate change for many years, but hadn't really done anything about it. And then September 2018, I had read a couple of more articles about climate change and thought, I want to be part of the solution. I'm part of the problem. So I shifted 100% to climate change and made that my focus. So I first started off as a philanthropist. And then after a couple of months, I shifted to focusing on technology after coming across the IPCC report that talked about the absolute need to do carbon dioxide removal to have any chance of solving climate change.
So, and kind of going off of that, carbon removal broadly, but direct air capture a little more specifically, how big of an industry does that have to be for it to be effective kind of in the large, mitigation, get to net zero kind of area?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to just make sure to keep in mind is that according to the IPCC report, no matter how much reduction emission we're able to achieve, there absolutely needs to be a massive amount of carbon dioxide removal. According to that report and other reports, they're estimating anywhere from 10 to 20 gigatons per year as we get towards the middle of the end of the century, a gigaton being 1 billion tons. Many people feel that that's actually overly ambitious, that based on the level of emissions reduction that appears to be happening around the world, we're likely to need twice that. That would be 20 to 40 gigatons a year. In terms of what that imputes to for market size, if you use an imputed cost of carbon of say $100 a ton, that would be approximately $2 to $4 trillion industry.
So that's a lot of scaling that has to happen between now and mid to late century. I guess, how far do you think direct air capture has to move to be kind of economically viable in itself, like where it's cost competitive, where it's bringing in its own revenue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's moved very well over the last 10 years from relatively high cost to still somewhat high cost. I mean, the last plant that was put up is a plant by a company called Climeworks, which announced cost about $600 a ton about 2 or 3 years ago. Now, for us to get to kind of true market levels, I think we'd like to get to $100 per ton or less. But just to put a perspective on it, solar and wind decreased by 250x over a 20 or 30 year period, wind 22x. So to go from $600 a ton to $100 a ton, I think is very doable. And actually some of the work I'm doing with Global Thermostat that I'm senior advisor to, we're expecting to get to much, much lower numbers than what was previously published over the next 12 months or so. So I think we're seeing a clear pathway to lower cost. And then in terms of economics, there are substantial credits available today in terms of carbon credits US 45Q, which provides up to $50 a ton for direct air capture and sequestration, the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which is a traded credit and offers around $200 a ton. So even if our costs are not at the ideal level, to the extent we can access, corporate public funded credits, that's a way to start to help us move down the cost curve.
And with 45Q, in existence and other credits like that, do you see a need for additional policy, like something like a carbon tax, as necessary, or do you see it as a benefit if possible but not necessary?
Well, I would say anything that helps support direct air capture or related industries like carbon dioxide utilization is very, very beneficial. I would say that carbon tax would certainly be helpful. But one of the things politically that's advantageous to direct air capture is that you don't actually need a broad carbon tax, even though that would obviously have a lot of benefits throughout the system. You could do much more targeted things. That's why 45Q got passed actually during this administration, because there's a much more targeted thing that was specific to something that there weren't natural constituencies against. At the same time, the existing program at a 45Q definitely needs substantial enhancement in terms of the technical aspects of it, in terms of the dollars that are provided. So there's need for a lot more. So that is a help or a nice signal, but at the moment it really isn't enough to substantially move this industry. So there's a lot of talk about additional legislation to either expand 45Q or provide other ways of providing credits, but that's what you really need, because you really want to have much more substantial credits, ideally north of $100 a ton, or well north of $100 a ton, to really push this industry forward. One of the nice things about it from a policy standpoint is that if a policy was put in place for much more substantial credits, they don't need to do it over a massive volume. Most of these companies don't need a huge amount of money to put up their plants, and so a large credit over a relatively modest volume would go a long way in the near term.
So, kind of moving to the the utilization and storage side, what do you see the role for EOR, enhanced oil recovery, as a way to scale direct air capture? Is it a long-term option? Do you see it as a temporary kind of up and running option? Where do you come down on that?
Yeah, so EOR, or enhanced oil recovery, is obviously very controversial today, because while it does achieve some level of CO2 sequestration, at the same time you are bringing up oil, which people say is kind of counterintuitive. I think that the general view is that it's a reasonable near-term option to the extent it helps support driving down the costs of direct air capture. So I think it's not something that people look at as long-term, not something to be done on a very large scale, but on a more moderate scale to help support technology development. I think that's kind of how people look at it. And then, of course, once you bring the cost down, you can then move direct air capture into a lot of other areas of CO2 utilization that would be perhaps more beneficial from an environmental standpoint.
And to that, I guess, what are the utilization areas that you see as most promising? I know that you're working with a company that works to put CO2 into concrete. Can you talk about that, and then talk about other areas you might see as promising for utilization?
Sure. So just to give a sense of the scope, the CO2 utilization industries are estimated to be anywhere from $1 to $5 trillion plus over the next several decades from several sources. So very, very substantial size industries, again, partly enabled by things like direct air capture, driving down the cost of CO2 so it could be used as an economic feedstock for making products. The main areas would be, one is fuels. And again, people will say, well, if you're going to use it in fuels and it goes back up, that's not a positive. But within certain areas, such as aviation fuel, it'd be very, very difficult to ever electrify jumbo jets. That's just simply not a very practical option. So they're still going to be flying. They're still going to need fuel. And ideally, you would have a low carbon fuel or a zero carbon fuel. The second would be CO2 to chemicals. And then one of the most important areas, I'd say probably the most important area within CO2 utilization that's very interesting is CO2 to concrete. The cement and concrete industries represent about 8% of worldwide emissions today. And one of the nice things about CO2 to concrete is that not only do you capture the CO2, but you put it in concrete, it's permanently sequestered in the form of a product. one of the leading or arguably the leading company in that area is this company Solidia that I'm an investor in. I'm joining the board in a few weeks. And they take CO2 and put it into cement and concrete and have a net reduction of emissions of 70% plus. So that's very important. They're very well developed. They actually have some plants that are up and running and are making product today. So it's a very advanced company. I'm actually raising some capital for them now, which I'm about to close in a few weeks. So I think that companies like Solidia, there are many others within the cement and concrete area because it's such a big and important area, are going to make a big difference in terms of helping to drive emissions. And it's true of, all these areas, chemicals, steel industry. There are several very interesting technologies with steel. So anywhere that CO2 is being emitted, there are these emerging companies that are trying to drive down the cost. At the same time, most of these technologies are from newer companies over the last decade. And so, there's clearly need for additional support for them to get to where we need to get to from a CO2 standpoint.
And kind of on that additional support, do you see policy needed to build the utilization industry, the concrete, making products out of things, making fuels, or is that just going to be a natural offshoot as the direct air capture industry grows?
Yeah, there really is a need for policy support on all these things, because from a practical standpoint, I think all of these areas look quite interesting long-term in terms of the cost they will get to and being relatively economic and attractive. But however, you got to get from here to there and get from here to there, you need funding. And, that's where government and policy is supposed to come in and drive the support. So that would be either direct credits like 45Q, which also offers up to $35 a ton for CO2 utilization, or things like what are called procurement standards. So a state or other municipality would say, you need to apply X% of your purchases to low carbon cement or steel or something, and so define procurement that way. So some combination of these policies are critically important for driving this. Again, I think these policies can be set up to be very generous in terms of what they give, because these companies are so small, the volume won't be so great. So it really, for a few, say, tens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars in total, it could completely transform these different CO2 utilization segments. So we're talking about relatively small amounts, fairly straightforward policy. It's just certainly a lot of discussion worldwide about the need to do it. It's just getting people over the hump to actually implement the policy, provide the support, and then drive these technologies to where they need to get to.
Now, you mentioned a little bit ago that most of the companies that are involved are kind of new startup type companies that are kind of getting into the space. Do you think the industry is going to evolve, kind of as these startups will displace incumbents, or do you think that some of these or all of these companies get bought up by larger, more established companies, kind of going into the next half decade or decade?
Yeah, I think it's like any set of emerging industries. Like you have the internet, and so in those cases, some companies got bigger and bigger and went public. Some got acquired. So I think it'll be like that. I do think that it's quite interesting that you have widely accepted forecasts that these will be multi-trillion-dollar industries, and yet very little money going into them. So at some point, people are going to wake up, whether it's individual investors who want to put money in at an earlier stage, whether it's corporates who want to do acquisitions, whether it's the public markets who say, hey, even though you're a newer company like the early stage internet companies, here's something we'd like to place a high value on because we see substantial growth. So I think any one of those avenues is likely to come about. But for the most part, most of the major innovation is coming from these smaller emerging companies coming out of incubators or accelerators, where you've got new emerging people with interesting ideas. And that's really where it comes from, as instead of the very large corporates, even though they have enormous amounts of money, they're not allocating the capital to these emerging areas for the most part.
A question. So we're getting a ton of questions from people who are tuned in. And so, one of them is talking about carbon exchanges. And do we need carbon exchanges like the Chicago Climate Exchange in order for this to work, or does this work purely kind of on on a business kind of model basis?
Well, I mean, given the significance of what we're trying to accomplish and the magnitude on a multi-gigaton scale to do this, I think we really want an all the above strategy. So to the extent you've got markets, credit, carbon markets, and they provide additional support with capital coming in, I think any way you can bring capital in, whether it's direct investment from private companies, whether it's policy support or government, funding, or traded markets where there's individual investors or corporates who can invest money on traded credits. Any combination of those, I think, are a big boost. So I think the point is we really need all of it. And also, I think there's an emerging interest in all of these things. So it kind of satisfies both sides. There's a need for it. There's a lot of capital looking for a place to do it. And certainly you hear a number of announcements from every day or every week, corporates saying, I want to get to net zero, of which a number have now announced that, or others saying, here's $1 billion fund or a $2 billion fund. I mean, the world has changed massively since I got involved 2 years ago, where then there was almost no one involved and even talking about this. And now on a weekly basis, you're hearing these $1 billion type announcements, these multiple corporate consortia to do net zero focus. So there's a lot of capital starting to be there, but anything we can do in terms of markets or anything else would be a huge help.
And one interesting announcement from a few months ago was the Microsoft announcement, where they went, as far as I can tell, a step further than almost any other company, where they said they were going to go back and remove emissions from going back to the 70s, which is, I guess would really be a driver in this industry.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that Microsoft announcement was great, both in terms of what it said for Microsoft and their commitment, and also for being a corporate leader and saying, hey, this is what corporate leadership is about. You take a stand, you put your money where your mouth is, you invest the capital, and they've committed both to doing a lot of sequestration or other offsets to offset their emissions. They've also set up $1 billion fund to invest in emerging companies that are important. So there's a lot of things that Microsoft has done. And then in addition to that, they've also gathered other companies. So there's a number of other companies that are now joining with them in some form of a group that are also sharing that level of commitment. So they're showing leadership. They're also going the effort to bring in a lot of other companies. So I think it's a great start, and we're really hoping to see a lot more corporates join this movement, which is critically needed for the world and for climate change.
Now, what do you see as the role for kind of federal research and development in this area? I mean, obviously, there's already companies up and running and operating. Does there need to be a whole lot more in R&D coming from the government or coming from other governments, or do you see this as already having moved into kind of the corporate R&D space, and it can kind of be handled like a Bell Labs kind of thing?
Yeah, I think federal R&D is really critical here, both our research development and demonstration, that basically this is a terribly underfunded area. If you compared this to point source capture, which is capturing CO2 from point source emissions from industrial sources, that's received hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars of funding support for research over the last several decades. Well, direct air capture, for example, has been in the millions or now the tens of millions of dollars. So, more recently, the Department of Energy has started to offer additional funding there. Again, it's in the tens of millions, not the hundreds of millions that we need. But it's really important because there's a lot of either existing companies that are out there, have done some interesting research, but really need funding to take it to the next level, whether it's the next level of research, from basic research to applied research, or to actually doing demonstration plants. And then beyond that, there's a lot of brilliant people and committed people at universities or national labs who need the support to take their new technology. In other words, I'm involved with some technologies, but there may be an even better or any number of additional, better technologies out there. And this is so important. We should get the funding necessary to put the money there, have those universities and national labs allocate the resources. They need that funding to do it, and then have these next generation great technologies come to fruition.
So I've got a question here about Solidia. And asking where does the CO2 that they're using come from? Is it direct air capture, or is it coming from somewhere else? And how does that affect the business model?
Yeah, at the moment, Solidia gets their CO2 from industrial gas sources that comes via gas distributors. So basically, this is CO2 that would otherwise potentially be emitted in the air. So there's a net benefit in doing it. But instead of being emitted into the air, an industrial source captures that and then gets it monetized by a gas distributor who would then supply to Solidia. So right now, it clearly has a positive impact on CO2 because it does reduce industrial emissions, indirectly. But the next step, which is what we're working on, is to actually take CO2 from the atmosphere via direct air capture and eventually get it into concrete. And actually, I'm in process on a project now, which is actually a Department of Energy funded project, if it got funded, which would take CO2 from the atmosphere and then end up putting it in some intermediate chemicals, which would eventually get into Solidia concrete. So I'm very much hoping that comes to fruition.
You're on the advisory board for the X Prize on this. Where do my experience with the X Prize, and it's been, they're really looking for big, thoughtful projects that can achieve that. Where do you see the industry in 10 years, 15 years as it continues to scale up and develops?
Well, I think those are kind of two separate questions. First, we're talking about X Prize. I mean, they have a X Prize specific for carbon dioxide removal, which is, they're still finalizing what the size of the prize would be, but somewhere between $50 million and $150 million depending on the corporate support. And that is really valuable because those sort of prizes have historically shown huge ability to kind of get people out of the woodwork, help them get funded, and then bring out these great technologies. Now, to the extent something like the X Prize gets launched and they bring these people, these groups out, and they have these technologies that move forward, get commercialized, certainly we're going to see over the next 5 or 10 or 15 years, I know these companies go from interesting ideas to demo plants to, properly funded and operating companies. And so, I think we anticipate that there'll be numerous plants that are in operation. So from the direct air capture side, they're going to be, a number of direct air capture plants, hopefully as much as possible, given the magnitude of the issue. But it's certainly going to be moving from now, it's in the thousands of tons per year of capture to the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, and hopefully we'll get to the millions of tons by the end of the decade, because eventually, obviously, we got to get to gigaton. And same on CO2 utilization. There are these, companies that are doing this right now, but again, at relatively modest scale. And we're expecting that they also will grow to very substantial scale over time.
Now, maybe the answer here is it doesn't really matter. A lot of these projects are in the U.S., some are in kind of, Northern Europe. Do you see other places around the world that are ready for, bigger CDR projects, direct air capture projects, or because of the way carbon is in the atmosphere, does it really matter where this industry lives?
Well, I mean, since CO2 is at 400 parts per million pretty much everywhere in the world, from a technical standpoint, you could put a plant anywhere. Now, saying that, ideally one puts a plant where you have relatively low cost energy, ideally renewable energy, so that is a plus. But the other factor on where to locate it is a function of the political process. So certainly, in the US, you have 45Q, which is a plus, but beyond that, there isn't quite as much policy support as ideally would be. Now in Europe, there's a lot more focus on direct air capture and CO2 utilization. And, they've recently set up a multi-billion-dollar fund to fund innovation in this area. So I think Europe is a very promising place because they're very, very supportive of this. So technically you can put direct air capture anywhere, but essentially it'll be a function of where the policy is, where the funding is. On the policy side, the only thing I would say in addition is that, given these industries are likely to be enormous in size, even someone from the government who spoke at a recent conference that I spoke at said this will be perhaps the largest industry in history. That size industry means enormous number of jobs. And frankly, whatever country or municipality or state makes the move on policy, that will be the place where more of that activity will happen and more jobs will accrue to that area. So I think while you could do it anywhere and policy can be wherever it is, I hope that certain nationalities will come to the realization that it's very much in their interest, not only solving climate change interest, to pass policy, support growth of the industry, and support job growth in that area.
So there really is a first mover advantage for countries who develop this policy.
Absolutely.
I've got a question from Oliver. Carbon capture requires massive amounts of energy. How do you manage, how do you solve the energy needs in terms of cost and supply?
Good question. Carbon capture requires some amount of energy. I think that that's kind of one of the technological challenges is, can you both reduce your capital expense and reduce your operating expense, which is a function of energy cost and energy usage. So I think that, I'm certainly personally working on some next generation technologies. I've actually come up with a new plant design, which I'm in the process of patenting on behalf of Global Thermostat, that I think is much lower energy and much lower capital cost. So the answer is yes, there's certainly an energy challenge and one needs to worry about energy usage. But I think as you develop these technologies, one of the challenges and opportunities is find ways to be able to grow it without overly burdening the energy requirements for that technology.
Have you seen or have you worked on any technologies that removes carbon from the oceans?
I'm familiar with those. I haven't worked directly with them. I mean, they're relatively early stage. I think that they may have some promise. I would say it's an interesting area. I think on the surface, it seems quite attractive because CO2 is in higher concentration in the ocean than it is in the air. At the flip side, there are complexities in dealing in an ocean environment and water environment. So while I've certainly looked at it, I've looked at the entire range of anything that's out there from carbon dioxide removal, I eventually settled on direct air capture because my conclusion is it's clearly going to be lowest cost, most scalable, most able to do it without environmental issues. The other issue with the ocean is that people are very, very sensitive to what you do in the ocean, obviously, and how it can impact things. And so given that sensitivity, there's a little bit of a hesitation sometimes to do some of that work. Again, it may well be promising, but I think direct air capture is the one that's got, checks all the boxes in terms of what you're able to do. And particularly now that there's additional emerging information that this industry is going to be able to drive down cost, which was one of the main issues. So with cost, I'm going to say no longer an issue, but less likely to be an issue over time based on improvements based on experience curve and learning by doing. I think direct air capture is going to be the ultimate one that we need to support and is the one that's going to get to the multi-gigaton scale over time.
You mentioned that you settle on direct air capture is the way you want to go. I have a question from Evan asking about what role you see for biomass energy with CCUS.
Yeah, I would say I don't see it really playing a role. To be honest, I think people talk about it, but I think that if you assess the LCA, which stands for life cycle analysis of biomass and CCS, when you use biomass, there's a lot of knock-on issues with using land, et cetera. So, there may be some subsets of using biomass that on small scale don't have a materially negative impact, but as you get to larger scale, which requires larger and larger land usage, if you get to a gigaton scale with biomass, you got to allocate huge amount of land area, and that's going to have opportunity costs in terms of land taken away for food production, other things, not to mention other, CO2 related negatives that come with it. So I would say, that was an area that people focused on years ago. I think at the moment, in general, most people are no longer that focused on that area.
Now, with the rise of direct air capture, do you see that changing the electricity generation mix or the technologies? Does this give, a certain technology an advantage or, kind of take out a technology?
I wouldn't say it gives anyone an advantage. I think from a CO2 standpoint, certainly you want to, have the most net CO2 impact. So you want to use renewables or other base load power that is not fossil based. So, I think naturally wind and solar, because of their lower cost, have been replacing coal and increasingly replacing gas. So I think that they're going to continue to grow as part of the percentage of the energy mix. But certainly we would look for direct air capture to make use of those, non-CO2 based energy sources, as much as possible. I
have a question on geologic structures for direct air capture and kind of Do you see geologic storage as, we talked about this a little bit before, that utilization is going to be a big part. How much do you see storage is playing a part in this?
Yeah, I mean, we see storage as being an enormous part of this. I mean, obviously, CO2 is a valuable product, so it'd be great to use it in products if you can. At the same time, and certainly we see some of these industries growing and hopefully growing to massive scale. At the same time, we need to move really quickly in terms of removing CO2. So we can't wait for there to be a sufficient utilization. You can very effectively sequester CO2. It's something that's been done for decades historically by oil companies in enhanced oil recovery. You can also, so either in a spent oil field or in a saline formation, you can very effectively sequester CO2. So we're certainly focused on that and are intending to do some very large projects. And one of the nice things about geologic storage is that there's trillions of tons of storage worldwide. So you're not going to have a capacity issue. Obviously, you need to, assess the right location to make sure there's the right characteristics. But industry has a history of very successfully sequestering CO2. There's no escape of CO2. So I don't think there's really any material risk with there. There's enormous capacity. And so I think that set of industries is also going to grow enormously over time.
What do you want the public to know about direct air capture? Like, what does the public need to know? What should they know, as it continues to grow in the US and around the world?
Yeah, I think the public really needs to recognize, first off, that electrifying vehicles and electrifying and using renewables in the grid alone is not going to solve the issue. That we absolutely need carbon dioxide removal, of which direct air capture is, the most clearly scalable alternative in that. And to know that it's critically needed. One, that second, it now as technology developed to the point that its costs appear likely to get to a relatively economic level, and it's clearly scalable. And that if the public gets behind it, both in terms of the public in general and as well as policy, that can help dramatically expand the size of this industry and the scale of the industry to start materially impacting CO2 levels, which is what we desperately need on a very, very fast timescale.
I have a question here for asking you to talk a little bit more about global thermostat and your involvement and where you see the company going.
Sure. So just to give a general perspective, stepping back, within direct air capture, even though it's this enormously critical area, and we're talking about billions of tons of CO2 removal over time, within direct air capture, there are really only 3 well-known companies worldwide that do it. There's a company called Carbon Engineering based out of Canada, Climeworks based out of Switzerland, and Global Thermostat, which is based in New York. So it's a very small number of companies. The reason I decided to get involved with Global Thermostat was having assessed all the different technologies. Global Thermostat has, what's widely acknowledged to be, the best technology, likely to be on the lowest cost pathway and most scalable. The heart of their technology is a monolith, which is a 6-inch by 6-inch cube based on catalytic converters that has 22,000 square feet of area within this very small cube, or half an acre of area. Because of that, they're able to apply a material that absorbs CO2 and desorbs CO2 very, very efficiently. So I think their technology has enormous promise. There's some very large corporates that have invested in joint development agreements with the company. So we still have our next stages in terms of getting our next scale plant up and running. But assuming we hit what we hope to hit in terms of our technology achievement and our cost levels, I think it's going to be an enormously interesting and critically important company over time.
I have a question here asking, some say that direct air capture is just a Band-Aid that postpones the carbon reduction effort. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly I can understand people saying that, oh, well, we don't have to worry about it because you can do something like carbon dioxide removal. At the same time, I don't think that's really a major thing that people are focused on, that even companies that are doing emissions today none of them are saying, oh, there's carbon dioxide removal, we don't have to do anything. Just the opposite. Companies are under pressure. So I don't see the fact that there are some small companies doing a little bit of carbon dioxide removal or trying to do it, taking any of the pressure off oil companies or cement companies or any big emitters worldwide or coal companies. So I think that's going to happen regardless. The second is that from a practical standpoint, again, you got to just do the math. According to the IPCC, there is no way to stay within the 2-degree targets of Paris Accords unless we remove as a world, 10 to 20 plus gigatons of CO2 per year. So one can talk about philosophically, is this a good thing or bad thing? You've got to do it. So, I think that there's no choice to even spend any time talking about it and acknowledging, yes, it's a question, but this has to be done. And I don't see it really materially slowing down companies who are left and right announcing net zero targets as we speak.
So I've got one last question for you. Next week, we're going to be gathering a group of 18 to 30-year-old participants in our first Future Leaders Climate Summit, which is focused on kind of young people who are, who want to go on to leadership roles in companies and government and nonprofits. What advice would you give to them, about carbon removal, about direct air capture, about what their roles could be, kind of in this space?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that, to the extent, first of all, having an interest in addressing climate change is critically important. I think that's a great thing to do. I think carbon dioxide removal and carbon dioxide utilization are a set of industries that give young people or any people the rare opportunity to both do something they're passionate about and have a great career and maybe make a lot of money from it. Because the practical thing is, this is not just a philanthropic exercise or people are trying to do good. I mean, obviously we're all trying to do good, but ultimately these are going to be industries that today are about $0, and they're going to grow to the hundreds of millions and then the billions, the trillions of dollars. That tends to mean that there's a lot of job opportunity and career opportunity. So I would say anyone who's interested in this, I would encourage them, because first of all, the world desperately needs it. Second of all, it's a very enriching activity to do something that's hopefully going to have materially positive impact on climate change and the planet. And lastly, it's a huge growing industry. We need people. We need good people. That's where you ought to go. I mean, if you're looking for a job, go to a growing industry. This one is going to grow faster than virtually any other industry on the planet over the next 20 years.
Excellent. Well, David, I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been really great, and we look forward to working with you more in the future.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And thank you to everybody who was on this call.
All right. Talk to y'all soon. Thank you.